Our next panel will focus on creating better opportunities to prevent loss and waste. It will be moderated by Helen Hollyman, the editor-in-chief of Munchies at Vice Media. She will be joined on stage by Brian Wansink, professor and director at Cornell University Food and Brand Lab, Brian Rowe, professor at the Department of Agriculture, Environmental, and Development Economics at Ohio State University, Claire Mifflin, associate at Kiss the Cart Architects, Tony Hillary, the executive director of Harlem Grown, and I have to say one of my favorite people in the world, Konstantin Zevarov, the founder and CEO of Blue Cart, and Emily Bachman, compost manager at of zero waste programs at the amazing Grow NYC. Please join me in welcoming them all to the stage.
Hello, everyone. It's so nice to see so many faces in here today. I'm Helen Hollyman. I'm so excited to talk to some of the smartest people about a topic that I think is super important right now. We're going to be talking about food waste, obviously, but this is something that I think rather than focusing on a lot of the negative aspects, I want to focus this panel on the positive aspects that everyone up here is really spearheading. So we're going to break it down into a couple different facets. We'll go into the psychology of how consumers are actually being driven to consume things and waste them. We'll look at the community building aspect. We'll look at the economics. We'll look at technology. There's a lot of ground to cover, and we have a little under an hour. At the end of we're going to leave the last 15 minutes for an audience Q&A. So if you have any questions, you'll be able to get to them. So rather than doing introductions, I just want to kick it right off. So Brian, I want to start with you. I want to get into the psychology of sort of the consumer drive. So talk a little bit about how consumers can make one small change into a bigger a behavioral change that can create a bigger impact.
There's a lot of small changes that consumers can make tonight. And this is when we look at food waste, we tend to want to look at the very top of the pyramid and say, from 30,000 feet, what can be done to kind of change everything? But there's a lot of changes that can be made within an hour of us getting home tonight that can make a really big difference. I mean, one super simple thing would be to simply just when we make the amount of a dinner that we plan on making, freeze half, or at least put half of it in the refrigerator and only serve half of it. We can always go back the other half. And it's almost guaranteed we're going to eat less, we're not going to miss what's packed up, and we'll end up wasting less and having a second meal.
So in the past, you've talked about this role of the nutritional gatekeeper in a family. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about how that role impacts the rest of the family decisions?
Yeah, great question. This nutritional gatekeeper, a lot of us say, oh my God, there's nothing we can do about how my spouse eats or how my kids eat. We throw up our hands, we don't even try. But what we found is that about 72% of the food that's eaten in the house ends up being influenced by the nutritional gatekeeper, the person who purchases and prepares most of the food in the house. Now, it's either done for the better or for the worst. It's for the better if you have a fruit bowl. It's for the worst if you have a candy dish. It's for the better if you actually go to a restaurant that serves salad, and for the worst if you don't. What we find is this person can, by doing very small things, can influence an entire ripple across the family. But the thing is, in the last 50 years, food costs have gone from being about 26% of our income to about 6%, or rather about 8%. So what we end up having is that there's not a lot of incentive for a lot of us to save on food, because there was back in 1960. And there's something called, and I want to say this because the economics of food we might think drives a lot of things, and I think it's the psychology that drives it more than the economics. We've done a series of really cool studies on this topic of what we call the paradox of waste, and it's the idea that the poorest families, and whether it be in Brazil, where we've done some of these studies in the United States, end up wasting more food as a percentage than middle class families. You kind of go, well, how can that be? Why that is because the nutritional gatekeeper. If you have some percent of the population that feels food insecure, let's say 20%, I'm going to throw that number out, who's felt food insecure at one point in their life or not, what's going to happen if as a grandmother, as a caregiver, as a mother or a father, they're preparing food for their children? For us, we're blessed in that if we finish everything in a serving bowl, we'd say, good job, good job, good job. But these are people who, when they see an empty serving bowl, they don't think good job. They think, I remember when that bowl was empty and I was still hungry. And for these sort of people, that's why they over-prepare a lot, even though they are the ones who can least afford it. Because they don't want their kids having that same feeling of want that they had when they were growing up.
So, Tony, Hillary, you have been amazing in impacting a lot of our youth. Can you talk about community building and how you have connected that back to the family and the work that you're doing?
Sure. Thanks for having me, by the way. You know, sometimes I sit on these panels and I'm wondering why I'm sitting here and I hear all of this. I mean, I'm working in Harlem, obviously. And although it's food waste, I'm in food justice, food access, it's all connected. There is no disconnect. The numbers are pretty staggering where I am. We talk about food deserts. What's that? 20. Over 25 million people live in what we call a food desert, and then there's another 25 million people who are living below the poverty level. That's 50 million people. Of the community that I serve, the vast majority of the children live in single-parent households. We work with an enormous number of homeless children. Food insecurity is normal. So what we doing at Harlem Grown, it's a reverse education. We focus on elementary school children. Sustainable practices, healthy nutrition, and a lot of mentoring to try to break this vicious cycle. And part of that, I discovered food waste is enormous. Last year at one site, we composted over 25,000 pounds of food waste just from the community. This year, we're on course to compost over 80,000 pounds on our various sites. And so as a result of that, we're starting meal planning to try to have conversations on how to more precisely plan meals. And I just learned yesterday on another panel I sat on, they said over 80% of us don't know what we're having for dinner tonight until about 4 o'clock. So how do we plan more exact meal plans with that? So these are things that I constantly think about, and that's why I love coming to these panels to kind of learn from my peers, and also reminds me that we are in the same place, although at various levels, but we're at the same place.
So something that I think both you and Emily share that's really amazing as a common thread is how compost can actually be empowering to building community. Can you both speak a little bit about that and examples that you've sort of witnessed in your process?
Go ahead, Emily. Okay.
So I'll start. I would love to see if you are in the audience and you ever have dropped off your food scraps at a food scrap drop-off site. Can you raise your hand? Okay, awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for going out of your way to compost. So a little bit of background and kind of laying the scene. So Grown YC has been collecting food scraps at Green Market since 2011, but that work was really inspired by the work of community groups all over New York City who decided that food shouldn't be wasted, that we needed innovative community-based solutions to collecting food scraps and composting them locally. So later today, Christine Datz-Romero will be speaking from Lower East Side Ecology Center. She really showed that if you build a food scrap drop-off site, people will come to it, that New Yorkers, despite how busy we are and how strapped we are for time, are willing to do the amazing thing of setting aside our food scraps, keeping them in a freezer, bringing them on the subway, bringing them on our bikes, bringing them to Union Square from the South Bronx. People are so passionate about this issue. And we're also really lucky to be in a city that has recognized that and supported that. So since 2011, we've expanded to operate 55 food scrap drop-off locations, 59 times a week. There are over 100 in New York City. It has never been easier to compost in New York City. And yet, since 2011, we have collected 9.4 million pounds of food scraps. That sounds amazing and enormous, but New York City wastes 1.1 million tons of food scraps every year. So our collections in the last 6 years have been less than half of 1% of the annual contribution of organic waste to landfills from our city. So that's crazy. And very grounding and very helpful for us to remember that as big and as institutionalized this industry becomes in New York City, it still has so much room to grow. And I think the really exciting thing about our program is that our food scrap drop-off sites are a space for community building, community interaction, sharing of ideas. So much of the questions that we get, so many of the questions we get are the simple things like, what's the best container to keep it in? Where should I keep it if I don't have room in my freezer? Does it matter if I bring it in a plastic bag? And there are varying responses to that question. And I think the other cool thing is that because we work with local compost sites, it's one of the few examples of a closed feedback loop between the generators of waste, the haulers of waste, and the processors. So as packaging changes, we can work with compost sites to see if that packaging actually breaks down in a local or industrial compost system, and then give that information back to the farmers at the farmers market, at the green markets, and to the shoppers and the people who participate.
I mean, Tony, I think what's so cool is you've cut down on school fights with compost. Can you talk just a little bit quickly about that? It's pretty amazing.
Believe it or not. And I don't use the word fight in schools. We work with elementary schools, and to use the term fight, it makes it seem like the children are predisposed to violence when they're not. What they are, they're scared, angry, confused, and hungry. And that's a fact. If you push me, I push you back, that's classified as a fight, and that's how we get those numbers. So, you know, the schools that we serve are very underserved. There's not a lot of services. The kids that I serve go to school for academics as well as breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They're having their 3 meals in school. Yes, New York City schools, guys. And we lead the sustainability initiative in the lunchroom. So it's recycling, composting, healthy nutrition, and a lot of mentoring. So now we have the kids engaged as part of lunch and breakfast, so they help us with our green teams, table captains, and we reduce our waste. But to touch on what Christine was talking about, we also have a workforce development component because we hire young men from the communities that we work in, and we train them through composting, raising chickens, urban farming, and we take these normally forgotten young men and we put them on a path to get their high school diploma, banking, registering to vote, the whole thing to get them back onto the mainstream, and then train them to be in-school mentors. So now we're in 6 schools replicating what I did in 1. And you can talk to some of these guys and they'll say they would never think that garbage would change their life or save their life in some cases.
So Brian Rowe, because we have 2 Brians here. So I want to talk a little bit about data, because that's something in this process that we're talking about, especially as a consumer. You know, it's important to, how do you collect data? How do you take that data and apply it to psychology of how people are consuming things, but also kind of closing the loop for the consumer and getting them into this sustainable method of existing in this system. Can you talk a little bit about the app that you're working on and the research that you're doing and how you are collecting some data?
Yeah, we are excited with some funding from USDA to develop a research app for that we train people to use. They'll take it out. It's been used successfully to measure food intake, and we're expanding that to then measure food waste as well. A simple app that people will take a picture of their plate before and after their meal, take a picture of their purchases, take a picture of their trimmings and their purges for the week, and then it all gets uploaded and measured by experts kind of back of the house after the fact. Getting a basis of strong quality data is going to be very critical. There's been some great efforts, other methods out there right now. NRDC has been doing a fantastic job trying to do some data collection, but those methods are really difficult in terms of giving us good quality data, and understanding the consumer is critical. Early supply chain, all the way up the supply chain, people can be doing their jobs, reduce food waste wonderfully. The net effect might be to create more food, drop the price, and our research suggests when people see cheap food, they are more likely to waste it. So consumers are the last and potentially the weakest link in this very critical system of reducing food waste. And so understanding the consumer is critical. And we see all sorts of odd tensions there. Composting is awesome. We were talking about this out in the hallway, but we have studies that suggest when people are told about composting, they actually kind of curb their own efforts to reduce waste. So it puts a really weird tension out there. We want to encourage composting, but then are we giving people a license, kind of a get out of jail free card in terms of their guilt towards reducing their own food waste? So lots of interesting problems that we hope that good data can help us solve.
So speaking of data, I mean, technology, Konstantin, you are at the forefront of this and connecting the dots in a really unique way. On the wholesale side, can you talk about some of the examples and impacts that you've seen at Blue Cart connecting restaurants to suppliers to farmers, and how that system works in the digital space?
Absolutely. So I work for Blue Cart. I'm one of the founders of Blue Cart with Jack Banto, he's somewhere in the audience. And what we do is we digitize the procurement space in the hospitality industry. We connect restaurants to their buyers and buyers to their restaurants. And as a result, we're giving these operators access to their own data, right? So what we're seeing now is that restaurants who have ease of ordering are able to run with leaner inventories. Leaner inventories, when you're dealing with highly perishable products, right, translates into direct food cost savings, less waste. And this is obviously not something that we proactively develop, but it's one of those things that we stumble upon. Got the company extremely excited. So what we did is, essentially we did a study. Today we have 36,000 businesses on the Blue Cart platform. 10 months ago, we sampled 12,000 of these restaurants on Blue Cart and outside of Blue Cart. And we realized that Blue Cart restaurant operators were saving on average 53% less food waste, right? And we didn't expect this, right? And we try to find out why. So things such as reducing the number of orders that you place, right? You don't have to return those orders back to your operators. You can run with leaner inventories because you have direct communication with your suppliers in a much more accessible way, other than waiting for every Tuesday when you see your sales rep and things like that. So things that we're doing ourselves based on these findings, for example, now we're working on functionalities that would enable suppliers to promote products that they have as surplus. For example, right, they have a surplus of tomatoes, highly perishable, right? They're able to push those products through Blue Cart and access a wide audience, right? So there are little steps that we're taking to essentially empower these operators to have access to their own data, right? And because otherwise these restaurants are, they're operated by gifted individuals, right? But in many cases, these individuals are operating in the dark, right? So they're kind of like guessing and using their experience to know where kind of like the sweet spot of procurement and inventory should be, right? But through Blue Cart, we're enabling everybody to have access to their own data and operate in a very efficient way.
So in the restaurant industry, which is kind of where I come from, food waste, I mean, it's roughly at like 40%. How are you seeing some of your clients in restaurants sort of tracking that data for themselves?
Great question. So in our particular case, keep in mind that there's some self-selection going on, right? If somebody's using Blue Cart, right, that means that they care about operations, they care about their own data, right? So as a result, they're less prone to waste a lot of food. Now, this 40% that you mentioned is generally attributable to the supplier side. So what happens is that, when we order, when a restaurant orders salmon, right, there's certain scraps that are not used. There's certain produce that do not see restaurants. So as a result, what we're trying to educate our audience, our restaurant operators, is how to have access to those byproducts, bycatch, and things like that. And it's actually working. So what we do is every quarter, we're collecting data from all of our thousands of restaurants, trying to divide that data into the different verticals. And to give you an example, one of these verticals is seafood, right? And we track, the purchase patterns of tuna, the purchase patterns of shrimp and salmon. And something interesting is we stumble upon the other category, right? And we see that the other category, month after month, keeps on increasing, right? And we were wondering, what is this, right? So there's things such as relabeling of new parts of the fish, selling bycatch products, right? So we're starting to understand that not only are we becoming sensitive to this, but even our users are becoming sensitive to ways that they can redesign their menu and include some of these other products that they wouldn't otherwise.
So speaking of restaurants and buildings, Claire has a really interesting perspective, I think, on this panel. You work in productive architecture, and in your mind, what role does design and architecture play within this discussion, and what you're seeing from a building resident to an actual business owner, if it's a chef, etc.?
I'm working with the AIA, the American Institute of Architects, to develop design guidelines to reduce all types of waste, not just food waste. So waste is a design flaw. Design can play such a huge part upstream and downstream. So the guidelines are going from how could you design a kitchen so you have less lost food, you don't have such a deep refrigerator maybe so you don't lose food in it, to how can you use data tools to measure your food waste, to give feedback, to how can you design a restaurant so delivery packaging gets taken back, so stuff on the upstream side. Also, how can you design a space to inspire people to waste less? Because design as architecture embodies aspirations people have of how they want to live. And so you can be on that very upstream inspirational side. But on the other hand, you also have your garbage bins in spaces, and if you just have one trash bin and your recycling and organics is inconvenient, you're not going to use them. And then we've visited over 50 buildings and followed the path of waste from where it's generated out to where it's on the curb and how it's collected, and seeing how the design of buildings influences that process and how it can make, I've seen buildings I designed that have created so much friction for the manager of the building and the porter and how to deal with the waste. And so just getting that feedback back to the designers and showing what things they can do to make that process better so the waste stays separated is another way design can help.
So what's a really great example of one of those wins for you?
So I guess on the front end, those examples about designing spaces so food is visible. You often think, okay, if we can have packaging that food will last for a month in the refrigerator, it's better. But I think it's actually less is better in this case. If we can see the food we have and have less of it, I think we'll end up wasting less. And so good design can present food in an aesthetic way and also mean the person inhabiting the space knows what food they have. And then on the other end, it's really, we're looking at, there's not a lot of data on waste. Looking at what Konstantin said, there really is, DSNY have done a pretty good job of trying to get data, but in the private hauling space, there is very little data, and we need to collect more data to know how much waste we have.
So that brings me to my next question for the group at large. We're in it's a digital age. We are so interconnected to the world. We're live streaming this right now. We'll probably all have, versions of ourselves in digital space in 20 years. Maybe there will be flying cars. Who knows? But either way, why is it that there is a deficit in data collecting and technology? Why is it that in this space particularly, we are at a deficit? And what is it going to take to push that forward? in a time when we have everything at our fingertips digitally?
I think it's partially attention. I mean, as an architect who's dealt with energy and water use in buildings, it's pretty easy to measure energy use. It's pretty easy to measure water use, and you can give feedback to people that makes them waste less of it. Measuring waste is a much more difficult proposition. It's
Perceived value, lack of perceived value. I don't think people have seen it as a material to be managed for profit or social benefit. That's changing, and I think then the data collection systems will, you've done it with your business, have found the source of value therein, and therefore have developed an apparatus to do so. And I think that needs to just take some more time to propagate throughout the system.
yeah, if waste isn't seen as a resource, you're not going to measure it. Yep.
In my environment, I mean, there's you know, it's a for-profit industry, right? So there's a disincentive for me to like talk to you and say, you know what, I'm wasting so much, right? How much are you wasting, right? So I'm not going to tell you that stuff, right? And even like if somebody's wasting a certain amount of food, it can actually hit the press like it did with Munchery, right? And then there's all this mess, right? So there's disincentive in sharing data. Now, in our particular case, our data is essentially anonymized, right? And we have a big sample size that enables us to essentially loop back to our users and say, like, listen, this is what's happening. Every single one of our users receives every single month a monthly report. Okay, in this monthly report, we share with them how they're doing relative to our population and how they're doing relative to the best performing restaurants, right? So therefore, and this is a personalized report that is not shared with anybody, right? So they can get a sense of how they're doing relative to their peers, right? Otherwise, you know, you're just guessing, right? And again, like, there's a disincentive for you to like share this data with your peers, and unless you have this very close relationship and you're not competing, right, where you can actually start sharing this information.
I feel like does someone else want to jump in? No. Okay. Well, getting back to the psychology of the consumer, because that's what we are in this room and everywhere. How do you think the consumer drive is shifting in this era of, you know, we have everything at our fingertips. Mm-hmm. We can have food delivery. We have meal kits that are readily available. Any insight into how you think this is shifting with consumer habits?
Yeah, I think one of the three biggest things that drive a lot of these decisions, like you're talking about tonight, that most of us don't know what we're having for dinner, end up being convenience, attractiveness, and what we see as normal in our lives. So that's why most of us eat at nighttime one of 7 patterns of meals. I mean, one pattern might be pizza, one pattern might be casseroles, one pattern might be pasta, something like that. And insofar as the normal pattern drives us one direction, and then convenience and attractiveness. And attractiveness can be the attractiveness of whether something's in the front of our refrigerator, whether it's in glass or it's in an opaque container, whether we think we can microwave it or whether we think we can't, whether we think it's been there 4 days or 1 day. Those are all things that end up influencing the attractiveness. But those will also end up being the drivers that make us say, geez, maybe I should just order pizza tonight, or maybe I'll try that one, deliver it to my home meal, but I'm going to do it for a month. I'm going to post on Facebook, I'm going to see how cool it is, and then I'm going to burn out and stop it because it's not either convenient enough, attractive enough, or normal enough compared to what my other alternatives are.
So thinking about things like, I don't know if anyone's heard of the ugly fruit movement, but I'm trying to embrace it. Okay. I love fruit. There it is. And you know, we think about worldwide movements like that are happening. What do you think that says, kind of looking back to you know, where we are? What other movements can we embrace that are more of a design structure, right? So if it is ugly, it's beautiful. If it's maybe redesigning even a glass-facing refrigerator, do you think that we need to, across the board, be embracing things that are essentially remarketing them?
Yeah, I kind of think that we need to reconsider waste totally differently, how we throw it away, the social activity. I mean, you see these community waste hubs in Europe where you're bringing stuff and it is a social activity. You're dropping maybe more infrequent streams like your batteries and stuff. But there's places in New York City where there just is not enough space in the building or the sidewalk to manage your waste. So having some shared drop-off hub in the street space maybe would make so much sense.
Well, there seems to be 2 pathways. One is the community building, make it people aware, consumers aware that they're part of the circular economy and get them to buy in. But then there's the other part of consumers today, and my sister-in-law, thank you for letting me stay with her last name, the Upper West Side. She talks about the effortless consumer movement. And so perhaps there's two paths here. One is the community build, people get involved and they feel good about it. The other half has to be, or maybe an even larger portion, has to be effortless. Everybody wants things to be effortless, and right now composting, reducing food waste is not a very effortless thing, although there may be some very simple tasks that we can promote to step us towards effortlessness.
Yeah, I totally agree. And design can help make
Yeah.
it effortless.
Yeah, exactly.
I think one thing important that's brought up with this issue is people have to get something out of it for themselves. They can't be just doing it for the good of the order. And one thing they get out of it is the community that you're talking about, if we design that community right. But the second thing they end up getting out of it, and we see this with the other movements that have really worked, is if they can actually change the way they view about themselves, or if they can essentially impression manage who they are to somebody who's important to them, say a reference group, that's when movements take off. That's why if you talk to a lot of people who are vegetarians, a lot of them, you say, was it for animal rights reasons? Oh, not really. Is it for health reasons? Oh, not really. A lot of it is because it's really cool to be a vegetarian among some reference groups. And whether that sticks or whether it just lasts until that burns out of favor, we don't know. But being cool to a group of people who you want to be with is another form of value that can ignite movements.
I think another important aspect is the practicality of it. So Grow NYC has food scrap drop-off sites in all 5 boroughs in very different types of communities, and therefore the message is adapted really drastically in different communities. We work really hard to communicate with people in a way that's culturally appropriate, in a way that's in their language, to listen to people about how they shop and how they buy food and how they store food, and to work with them. And in our latest expansion, we've noticed that rats really get people excited about composting because the way that our city deals with solid waste is insane. We put mixed putrescible waste with recyclables in puncturable bags on the street. And we are asking pests to come hang out in our beautiful public spaces. So the most logical thing is to keep the putrescent waste, the food scraps, the organic waste, separate from everything else. Keep it in a closed container. Keep it in a cooled area if you can, but if you can't, just put a lid on it and make sure a rat can't get in it. And then you're flipping. It's not about waste, it's about public health. It's about environmental justice. It's about the beauty of our neighborhoods and reclaiming this public space that is our sidewalks for something better than rat habitat.
Yeah, we're looking at that, definitely trying to get bags off the streets, because the whole design guidelines are not just in buildings, it's in our public space too.
Yeah, and there are thousands of community gardens in the 5 boroughs, and so it really doesn't make sense for someone to freeze their compost, go from the Bronx to Union Square. There should be more accessible drop-off points in every community garden, because we rely on compost because urban farming, gardening, the soil is depleted constantly. Your other alternative is to go purchase compost or gardening soil or something when you have the resource right there in a bin, right from your community, that you can turn it over. 7 months later, we're using that food waste to grow our new crops. So I think if we could connect the dots on the on the street level, the local level, I think we could alleviate some of that.
Yeah.
Constantine, I know
From the restaurant side, obviously, we're much more focused on food waste prevention as opposed to remediation, right? Now, what I've learned over the last couple of years is that there's a tremendous opportunity to kind of educate consumers about what I see as potentially one of the biggest culprits in food waste in the restaurant industry, and that is having a fixed or a semi-fixed menu, right? So going into a restaurant and expecting to find tuna there, right? Or going to a restaurant expecting to find a certain dish regardless of the season that it is, right? So obviously that drives waste, right? Expecting to find the same food regardless of the time of the day that I go there, right? So if I go towards the end of the day, I should not expect to find the same food, right? What that does, essentially, it would, one, mitigate waste at the restaurant level, right? Two, it also I would get much more excited going to my favorite restaurant and getting surprised what I'm gonna eat there that day, right? So if we can slowly educate individuals that expecting a fixed menu, right, is just not best practices, right? Like it implies that your food's going to be less fresh than it would otherwise. It implies that your food's going to be, much less local, right? It needs to be imported. You're not going to get tomatoes year round here in New York, right? So those are coming from somewhere, right? So your expectations of how fast the menu should evolve, or expecting that you're going to get the same food from one day to the next, right? That's a huge opportunity for us to educate consumers. And I've seen some restaurants that do not have a menu, right? And I know for a fact that they're extremely efficient, right? So, and I know also that they're extremely, well regarded in the industry because people go there and they want to be surprised, right? Like what's going to happen today, right? It's kind of like a whole experience, right? So if we could educate individuals that, that's an opportunity, right? Restaurants would be much more profitable, much more efficient. They would produce less waste, right? And I would get much more excited going to a restaurant and getting surprised, right?
Mm-hmm. So I want to get to the Q&As because I'm sure we have some questions. I believe there's going to be a microphone that is the magic microphone is being passed around. So let's get started right there in the back.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Shrila Sharma. I'm a chronic disease epidemiologist and faculty at the University of Texas School of Public Health. I'm also representing Brighter Bites, which is a nonprofit. The question is for the two Brians. I'm just curious about from a health impact perspective, what are your thoughts with regards to the various, the food recovery models that are being discussed today, and how does it potentially impact health? Are people just eating more, with reduced food waste, or is there a substitution effect that you want to see? And are we tracking that information as it pertains to health outcomes? Because healthcare costs on the other side are soaring as well. So if you can talk a little bit to that, I'd appreciate it.
No, some of the research we've done does show that there may be some creeping clean your plate types of behaviors when people are encouraged to reduce food waste. And so we do need to be cognizant of that in our interventions at the consumer level to make sure that it's not going from plate waste to your own waste. And I think you spoke about portion size as being a key issue, and a lot of your research looks at portion size issues.
Yeah, thank you, Shyam. One of the things that we can say is, if there's less waste and there's people are eating more, well, the alternative is just to have less on the table to begin with. And that's why a lot of our initiatives that we're working on now is how do we get people, and nobody wants to settle for less in the United States. So how do we get people essentially to put less on the table to begin with smaller portions? And essentially, like the cutting the portion in half and things like this are ways they can do it. But I think an important point is this idea of the Clean Plate Club. Like we've taken analyses that we've done of a lot of full meals of people, because we hear about the Clean Plate Club, which most of us probably belong to or think we belong to. We think we uniquely belong to it, and we don't. Basically, every adult we've looked at eats, on average, over 90% of the food they serve themselves. Not that a restaurant serves them, but they serve themselves. Because basically, as adults, we know what we like. We basically know what we don't like. So if we serve it, we're basically going to eat it. Now, with kids, it's a little bit different. And this is where I think your question has a lot of powerful insight, is this stuff really influences kids, because kids, we find, only eat about 60% of the food they serve themselves. Okay, because they don't know, they're not calibrated to when they're going to be full or not. They don't really know what they like, what they don't like, and so naturally, if your kid's not eating all their food in their plate, it just doesn't mean they're wasteful. It just means they're normal.
the other angle on this is a food recovery network. I was talking with Patrick O'Neill, I think he might be in the audience earlier, and talking about how in the food recovery space, trying to get fresh produce being a key item being donated to the food banking system across the United States, and making sure that's a key portion so that those who do rely upon food recovery for some of their calories are getting a healthy selection of calories from that as well. And that's critical.
Good question. Thank you for that. There in the back?
Hi, thank you all for coming. Really cool to hear about the research, the design, the analytics, and obviously the community-led, all very important. My question is really around sort of the data, because I heard sort of two different interesting strategies. One with the Blue Cart around, you have this proprietary information, how do you, using it when sending it to companies that they're sourcing, how to inform their decision. On the other side, you have, I think, the USDA research around getting correct if I'm wrong, getting consumers to kind of input around their food baskets, if I'm correct. So I'm sort of curious how you can sort of reconcile information together, the proprietary and the open source, to kind of help decision makers, policy makers, CSOs, whatever, NGOs, to kind of improve their mission statements, whatnot. Just kind of curious how you can reconcile. Thank you.
Great question. From our side, we realized that we have a tremendous asset that does not belong to us, right? It belongs to the community. So what we've made a conscious decision is right now, it's a little bit of an ambitious goal, but right now we're going to publish in October a quarterly report, and essentially it's going to share all of our data, anonymized and aggregated, on what's happening with seafood trends, meat trends, produce trends, different categories, right? And we're going to make this data available. And like I said, it's a little bit ambitious because I'm not sure if we can actually reproduce this every single quarter. It's just quite a task, and we have a business to run at the same time. But nonetheless, we're going to start publishing this. You can expect this definitely semi-annually. The data's in-house, and as we grow our infrastructure, we're going to make sure that this data is much more accessible for everybody.
That's going to be very exciting to Elise Govan here in the audience at USDA and her colleague Gene Busby at USDA, who are desperately trying to get their hands around high-quality data to look over the entire system. USDA and other federal agencies are very focused on food waste, but the data is still lacking. So proprietary sources are always a tough nut to crack for federal agencies because of the issues you have talked about. So being able to get cooperators through anonymized data would be fantastic at every level, from the farm all the way up through the retail and then the consumer level. It's going to be critical to help set priorities, to track progress, and to see where tensions might be arising, counterproductive efforts that might be arising from different interventions going on at the same time. It's a great question.
Right here.
This is a question for Brian. I was torn about reading that Amazon would be lowering costs at Whole Foods, just in terms of the perception of how we value food, and wondering if you could just talk on that, your thoughts or opinions.
One view of that is that in trying to expand the market, they might be losing the market that actually sees the high cost, high value, sort of the typical people who are shopping at Whole Foods consistently in the past. But the other view is, how can you broaden the market and make this more accessible to people who maybe aren't that sort of maybe extreme in what they're looking for, but are more kind of fair weather, healthy eaters. And I'm not exactly sure how that's going to play out very well, but I know that a lot of the noise that we hear, for the most part, are from the real hardcore users, and that's not the majority of the population out there. So the majority of what we hear is coming from a very minority of the potential consumers.
I feel like I need to look this way because you in the back. One moment.
I think my question is for Brian Rowe, I think. My name is Bill Burke. I'm an economist, agricultural economist at Michigan State. It sounds like a lot of what I'm hearing is about, or is going to involve, increased production costs, increased monitoring costs, increasing awareness, which doesn't come for free, all the while, if it's all successful, lowering prices of food, right? Because you're going to be increasing supply, decreasing demand. So that seems like a paradox to me, and you kind of hinted on it a little bit. So what am I missing? And what's the role for economists in solving this problem?
Yeah, there are tensions all the way along the supply chain. That's kind of what motivated me to get into this, was thinking about those. So for example, if one segment of the supply chain does their part and extends shelf life a bit, does that mean they then hand off liability and a shorter shelf life to the next section in the supply chain? Or suppose consumers are massively effective at reducing food waste, is that then just a 10% reduction in consumer demand to farmers, and the price of their land goes down, and their prices go down, and some of them go out of business in the short run? As Secretary Vilsack talked about, in the long run, we do have a huge population to talk about. So economists, I think, have a very important role to think systematically, think across the segments of the supply chain, and think about those interaction effects. For example, the rebound effect is something that we've written about and thought about deeply. That is, again, if everybody does their job, pushes food prices down, and then the consumer sees the cheaper food price, maybe through Whole Foods lowering their price through Amazon, and then is less concerned about that, you can actually get perverse things where the amount of food supply or food waste reduction doesn't change at all. England might be running into this right now. They did a great job, reduced food waste considerably, but have hit kind of a plateau and even been backsliding a bit in terms of their total food waste reduction. And some of the sentiment there is that it might be because food prices have come down and consumers kind of lost their edge in terms of motivation to reduce food waste. So I think that's the role for economists here, to think about those big picture ideas.
Any other questions? Right here? Right there, yeah.
Hi, good morning. Sean McLaren. I'm with the board member for Slow Food NYC and run a local nonprofit organization, community development organization. One of the things that I keep hearing and some of the stuff we talk about is needing to get outside of our bubble, as it was described earlier, leveraging the community behaviors or consumer behaviors, and this issue of the idea of waste, right? And I'm curious, time-based concepts like shelf life seem to be very integrated in consumer behaviors. I'm wondering how other concepts, time-based concepts like surplus versus waste, might impact the work that you do in your various companies or communities.
Well, from my perspective, this is something that I personally think very frequently. I mean, like, here we're like an outstanding crowd, right? But we all think alike. We all think of the same issues. This is the things that disturb us, right? And we have subject matter experts that are sharing their knowledge, right? Now, to have a measurable impact, we need to figure out how to evangelize the rest, right? And so this is kind of like what the things that I'm mentioning of, like, having transitioning away from a fixed menu and things like that. If we educate the rest, then we can have an impact, right? And if our growing community that cares about food waste, right, it's definitely important, but our job is to educate the rest. So that's kind of like the type of thinking that I'm carrying away, is like, how do we expand this knowledge base to the other folks that are not in this room? Yeah.
We have one more very quick question, and then that's going to be it if anyone has anything. No. Okay. Well, I wanted to thank everyone on this panel for coming out today. Thank you all to you guys for such great questions and for coming out.